G'day guys, there's been a lot of talk recently about the new Arks of Omen season for Warhammer 40k. There's lots of rumors going around about points costs, about the new detachment, about the new potential builds, but there's one thing that I think has been disastrously overlooked, and it particularly pertains to the Chaos Space Marines, and that is the new secondaries that every faction's going to be getting. They've specifically said on the Warhammer community site that every faction is going to have 3 secondary options, and all of the different chapters and legions for both the Heretic Astartes and the Adeptus Astartes are going to have access to 2 unique secondary objectives, which means that all of the existing Chaos Space Marine legions are going to get an additional secondary objective. Further to this, we now know that they're actually going to be updating existing secondaries as well, as previewed in the Emperor's Children secondary that they showed on the Warhammer community site. So what I want to do today is talk about the current rules, what we currently understand, some predictions and some ideas on what changes we can expect, and also share some of my thoughts on what these new secondaries could look like for the Chaos Space Marines. So let's get into the video.
Look for the Blood God.
Alrighty guys, so the first one that we're going to look at is the Emperor's Children, because we've already seen the leaked updated secondary for them. So we're going to go through this new secondary, what this could potentially mean for the other legions, and then also what potential secondaries could be the secondary one, because every legion is going to get 2. So let's have a look at the Emperor's Children. Alright, so the updated secondary is confirmed to score at the end of your turn instead of the end of the battle round as it was previously. And also it's confirmed that it just requires you to kill units, whereas previously you had to kill more units than your opponent. And it does still require the holding of more objective markers than your opponent. So this objective is much stronger, as you can score it in both players' turns and you only need to kill things to trigger it, making it much harder for your opponents to deny. For their second secondary, we have no information yet, but I would expect an action-based objective, given the existing one covers objective markers and kills. So I think we're going to see a bit of a consistent theme here, where I suspect what's going to happen is all of the legions who have a secondary that's to do with actions, all of the shadow operations, will get a new secondary that'll be something to do with engaging with your opponent, whether it be in battlefield supremacy or whether it be in, no prisoners or something like that. There'll be a secondary for objectives with actions, and there will be a secondary for objectives with killing. So that's what I'm predicting is going to happen here. And I think with the Emperor's Children, we've seen that the secondary that exists has gotten significantly better. So let's extrapolate from that. Let's look at some of the existing secondaries and how they could be improved and try to predict what GW might do. And then also talk about the potential other secondaries for these other legions. Let's start with the first among traitors, the Black Legion. All right, so their current secondary is quite hard to achieve. It's basically an action that only 1 unit from your army can perform per turn. It completes in your next command phase, and you cannot perform it if enemies are on the objective that you're attempting to do the action on. So even the removal of one of these restrictions would make the objective solid, whereas removal of multiple makes it very strong. For their secondary objective, I'm expecting something similar to the old Stranglehold, or something similar to the Tower version, perhaps where you get points for playing aggressive in early turns of the game. So we all knew and loved Stranglehold, and the Tower players have a lot of fun with their version. I think the Black Legion could see something similar, where, it's hold more objectives than your opponent, worth 4 victory points if you do it, but it's only achievable in the first 3 turns, or something to that effect. So, that's the Black Legion. Let's get into the next of the Chaos Traitor Legions. Alright, the Word Bearers. Currently their secondary is very strong, one of the strongest in the book. However, only 1 unit can perform it per turn. It still completes in the end of your next command phase, unless you have an icon in the unit. But the big deal breaker here is that a unit cannot perform the action if there are enemies within range of the center. So this is a big deal breaker. If they made it so that you can't do it regardless of enemy units, it would be strong and in line with things like the Imperial Knights. For their second objective, I'm expecting something like a Warpcraft secondary. Something like the Grey Knight's psychic action on a secondary combined with retrieve Octorius data or whatever, something in that regard. So the Word Bearers, they're a very Psyker-heavy army. They're very Psyker-heavy in the lore. So I think something to do with Warpcraft could be really cool for them, and it would pair well with their ritual nature. That secondary that they've currently got, the biggest problem with that is all your opponent has to do is throw a unit out into the center of the table, and you can't do your action. And because the action often is going to complete in your movement phase, if you have an icon, you actually don't have the ability to kill them off of the objective in order to do your action. So they can just throw units in there, it can be one lone scout. There's nothing you can do to stop them. So that's a real big deal breaker for this objective, and if they get rid of that restriction, that'll be really powerful. And also a second objective, which is like, you know, maybe it's you have to do a psychic action in each quarter, like retrieving Octarius data or retrieving Nephilim or Nachman data, you know, like those old secondaries. But instead of doing an action with a unit, it's doing a psychic action with a psyker. Something like that could be really cool. Perhaps it's like Warp Ritual, where the first time you do it, it's worth a couple of points, and then it increases in value the more often you do it. Could be really interesting. So that's what I'm expecting for the Word Bearers. Let's have a look at one of the worst secondaries in the current book, and that's the one for the Night Lords. So their current secondary is hot garbage. Most of the units are effectively immune to morale these days because they either have really high leadership or they have such a small unit size that by the time you would push it to a point where it would take a leadership check, you've probably killed it anyway. And further to that, your opponents can choose not to fall back, which denies you points from this secondary objective as well. Killing enemy units is good, but needing them to fail a leadership to score victory points is quite rough. So for me, what I'd like to see is instead of your opponent needing to fail, you should get VP if your opponent has to make a morale check, instead of every time they fail a morale check. Also, you should just get a victory point for every time you kill a unit, up to 1 per turn, and if they fail their morale check, it's worth double, so worth 2 victory points, instead of just giving you 1 should they fail. And for their second new secondary, I'd expect to see something like behind enemy lines, but weighted heavily in earlier turns. So the Night Lords are all about sneaking up on their opponent and getting in enemy lines deep and penetrating deep. So I'd like to see something where it's like, you know, score a number of victory points equal to the turn number or something like that for being in your enemy deployment zone, but inverted. So turn 1 you'd score 5 points, turn 2 you'd score 4 points, turn 3 you'd score 3 points, so on and so forth. So basically it rewards you for getting into your opponent's line turn 1 and staying there for as long as possible, which is what I think would be really on point for the Night Lords. And as for their current secondary, if they can just make that, all of those restrictions, they all make sense, they're all really good for the lore, but instead of your opponent have to fail a morale check, maybe just forcing them to take one is worth victory points, you know? Instead of killing an enemy unit and then having them have to fail, maybe killing them is worth 1, and then if they fail, it's worth 2. This would definitely bring the Night Lords back into line with some of the other secondaries that we see on the other factions in the game. Alright, now let's talk about one of the other really particularly bad secondaries in the new Chaos Space Marine Codex, and that's the Iron Warriors. So for their secondary, your opponent gets to place objective markers on the table. Then you can't do the action if there are enemy units on those markers, and only 1 unit from your army can perform this action per turn. So what I'd like to see is instead of your opponent placing the markers, it should be their home marker plus 2 markers that are outside of either deployment zone that your opponent can select. So this way, the objective markers already exist, you already are going to want to be there, so there's already a reason. The current problem is that they can place those objective markers in areas of the table that you have no value being there. So it becomes a game where all of a sudden, not only do you have the 6 objective markers on the table, but you also have the 3 ones from this secondary. So you have, you know, up to 9 objective markers you need to control. That's a real problem. As for their second objective, I'd like to see an inverted behind enemy lines. Like how Drukhari have an inverted engage on all fronts. So by inverted, what I basically mean is, basically you score victory points as long as there are no enemy models or enemy units in your deployment zone. So it forces the Iron Warriors to play a castle defense style game, which I think would be really cool. I know Iron Warriors are traditionally all about breaking the bastions, not necessarily defending them, but of the Chaos Space Marine Legions, if there was one that was going to defend your house, you'd want it to be the Iron Warriors. So having the Iron Warriors have a defensive playstyle where they can sit in their deployment zone, shoot down enemy units, and try to play that cagey game, I think that would fit really well with the aesthetic and with the style of the army, and would be a ton of fun, and also hopefully score quite high. Now let's talk about one of the most controversial secondaries. Some people think it's amazing, some people think it's horrible, and that is the Alpha Legion. All right, so it's very interesting. It's very strong, but it's also very hard to achieve. Only one unit can perform this action per turn. It completes at the end of your next command phase, and it cannot be completed by characters. So removing a couple of these restrictions is all I think it would need, and it would become very strong. If multiple units could achieve it, or if it could be completed by characters, or if it completed in the same turn, like at the end of your turn, it would become a very, very strong secondary. And for their second new secondary, I'd expect something to do with reinforcements, like scoring a victory point if a unit that arrived from reinforcements earlier in the game kills something or capture an objective marker, similar to the Blood Angels. Alpha Legion are all about those sneaky, tricky tactics, so I really like their main secondary where they're able to flip an objective marker by doing an action near it, and that stops your opponent from being able to achieve those victory points by holding that objective marker. And it also means you've got to be in your opponent's deployment zone, you've got to be coming in from angles. That's a very Alpha Legion way to play the game. So I really like that, and I'd like to see that theme continued in their second objective. Something like the Blood Angels, how they basically get victory points if a unit that arrived from reserves kills something. But instead of achieving huge victory points for doing that, I'd break it down and go, cool, if something that arrived from reserves takes an objective marker, maybe that's worth 2. And if something that arrives from reserves kills something, maybe that's worth 2. Instead of the Blood Angels version, which is where it's worth 3 or 4 if it's done in the same turn that they arrived. So a similar style objective, but it's a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more controlling the board and doing those sorts of things. And that would play really, really well into the Alpha Legion. All right, now let's talk about another controversial one, the Red Corsairs. So their current secondary is interesting, but it's very hard to achieve, similar to the Alpha Legion, where basically it cannot be completed if enemy units are on the objective markers, it completes in your next command phase, and it can potentially score quite low. So removing a couple of these restrictions, or just making it worth more victory points should you achieve it, makes it very strong. You know, going for this much effort to try to achieve that secondary to only score 2 victory points feels quite bad. Further to that, for their second new secondary, I'd like to see something like Engage on All Fronts, or something like Reality Rebels from the Daemons Codex. So the Red Corsairs objective, the current one that we have access to, is basically you move out, you do actions, you pick up the spoils of war, and then you got to bring them back into your own deployment zone to score high on it. And there's a lot of things that you have to do. It's not one of those things where it's like go out, do an action once, victory points. It's like go out, do an action, survive an entire turn, then come back to your own deployment zone and survive till the rest of the game. That's way too many things to do for one unit. And it also means that your opponent can just nuke that unit and it's game over. So I'd like to see either some of the restrictions move, like maybe multiple units can do it, or maybe, the action completes at the start of your movement phase or during the movement phase, so you can move across an objective and pick it up on the way. Something like that would make this objective way more achievable, or alternatively, just make it worth a shit ton more points, because then it's like you might actually build a game plan around going in, taking that objective, getting back into your own deployment zone, because doing so might be worth 10 victory points or something crazy like that. In which case you'd actually get this game where it would play very differently than other games, because you'd be going for this big 10-point victory point, which means your opponent would have extra incentive to kill that unit, which means there would be this whole dynamic would play out, and it would be really interesting to see on the tabletop. So that's what I'd like to see with their current one. And for their new one, I sort of see the Red Corsairs as kind of hitting you fast from multiple angles. So I'd like to see something like an Engage on All Fronts style mission, maybe something like the Reality Rebels from the Daemons Codex, because, it's basically having more units in each quarter and within the center than your opponent. Maybe even something like have more units within a certain range of the edge of the table to represent the way that you're sort of flanking them and hitting them from those angles would be really interesting. Alrighty, now, last but absolutely not least, let's talk about the creations of Bile. So this is currently the strongest secondary in the book. And basically, killing things in melee is something that you're already going to be doing without any thought. Just by playing the game, just by trying to play for the primary points, just by trying to win the fight, you are likely to be killing units and you're going to be killing them in melee. And combat is already somewhere where Chaos Space Marines thrive. You very rarely see a Chaos Space Marine list that's built around doing damage in the shooting phase. Sometimes they'll have supplementary shooting, but their primary damage is done in combat. So really, if you're playing Chaos Space Marines, there's no reason to not take this secondary. So if anything, this secondary might get nerfed. Personally, I don't think it should, I think it should remain as it is because it's strong and it's a varied list run by a skilled opponent can make this hard for you to max out. You know, like if they protect their characters, present you with vehicles to kill, protect their infantry units, they can actually really limit this, but they have to be a competent player with a very varied list, which makes for a very interesting game. For their second new secondary, I'd expect something that would be action-based, you know, built around enemy units. Something like Psychic Interrogation, but instead of using a Psyker to do it, it's just like one of your characters maybe does a leadership check against your opponent and basically scores victory points that way. Like I said at the start, I think when you've got an existing objective that's about killing things, I think the new objective will most likely be about doing actions. And that way it sort of gives you a bit of variety in the way that you can build your list and build your game plan. So I think with their primary objective being all about killing infantry and characters, or non-vehicles, I think their second one should be similar vein because it needs to be on brand for Creations of Bile, but maybe some kind of leadership-based check that you can do on your opponent, you know, where you roll higher than their leadership on 3d6 or something like that, and if you do it, you get 3 victory points. And that sort of represents, you know, maybe interrogating them, or maybe, you know, extracting information or DNA from them or something like that, in a similar way to the one where you're killing them is extracting. Similar sort of thing, maybe studying their moves, studying the way that their physiology works so that you can provide that information back to Fabius Bile. So that's what I'd like to see for the Creations of Bile. Now you'll notice that I haven't mentioned Thousand Suns, Death Guard, or World Eaters in this video, and that's because each one of them is going to, or currently has, their own codex, which is going to have a whole suite of secondaries in it. As far as I can tell, each one of these is going to get 3 secondaries of their own, so the World Eaters are going to get 3, and I might do a second video speculating on what they could be. We currently have no information whatsoever, and it's very hard to predict because we don't know what the mechanics in that book are going to be like. You know, we can make some educated guesses, but it's kind of tricky. I'm expecting there to be blood tithes and things like that, so maybe challenges. There's a lot of things that could be happening in that book, so I don't want to speculate on that for now. And the Death Guard and the Thousand Suns, maybe I'll do a separate video on them as well. This video, I just wanted to talk about Chaos Space Marines, mainly because GW did preview the Emperor's Children, so we at least have something to go on to get an understanding for what these secondaries could look like. So thanks for tuning in, guys. I hope you enjoyed that video. Make sure to like, subscribe, share, all that good shit. You know what to do. Join the Discord. We've got a sick community over there where we do one-on-one coaching. We share hobby videos and content and photos of what we're working on. We have really good chats in there. We do list advice. It's a really sick little community. And if you want to show your support to the channel, check out our Patreon. Check out our Teespring site where you can get shirts just like this one here. And also pick up a set of neoprene objective markers. These are all ways that you can show your support for the channel and get a little something back for yourself. So thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
Walk for the Blood God.
The Warhammer community suffers from some of the most prohibitively expensive essentials in the world, especially Australian content creators. Every single day, Dean wants to create content, but he can't. Suffering from old, worn-out brushes, expensive model kits, and costly software and equipment he can't endure much longer. Just look at this dirty paint water. Would you drink this? Would you let your child? Even a small monthly donation can help provide Dean with clean paint water, basic tools for survival, and access to life-saving information and education. So please, follow the links in the description below and find out how you can sponsor a mad cunt like Dean today and end the suffering. Suffering that is cruel, unsustainable, and your fault.
Do your objective markers ever get lost behind terrain or other models and become difficult to see? Do they ever get bumped and accidentally moved during a game? And do they ever spark arguments about distances? Well, not anymore. Introducing the blog for the Blood God, not even remotely patented neoprene objective markers. Made from the same material as astronaut suits, or maybe military equipment, or probably neither of those things, this 2mm thick neoprene synthetic rubber is tear resistant, water resistant, and is designed to last. But that's not all. The blog for the Blood God, not even remotely patented neoprene objective markers come in a variety of different designs and styles to suit any faction represented in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. These objective markers are a perfect gift for yourself or a friend, and are a perfect way to flex and show your opponent that not only are you a smarter, cooler, and better 40k player than them, but you also have more disposable income than they do. For the low price of $25, you'll get not one, not two, but 6 neoprene objective markers, perfectly designed for 9th edition Warhammer 40k. But wait, there's more. For a limited time only, people who sign up on Patreon to support Blog for the Blood God as a Skull Champion tier $5 per month member will gain access to a custom design service where I will design a unique logo to support their gaming club, like the one I did to the left here for the Potato Farmers local gaming club here in Melbourne. Follow the links in the description of this video to pick up your set today.